Hello. This time, let us see what happened at the Battle of Cynoscephalae. This iconic battle was fought during the Second Macedonian War, and in this action, the forces of the Roman Republic fought against the Kingdom of Macedon. By the year 197 BC, King Philip V was in the southern sector of his frontier with 26,000 men. 18,000 of them were heavy infantrymen, 6,000 were light infantry, and 2,000 cavalrymen. This army was moving towards the west, to the city of Scotusa, but close on its heels was Titus Quinctius Flamininus, with 28,000 men. Of these, 20,000 were heavy infantrymen, 5,500 were light infantry, 2,500 cavalrymen, and 20 elephants. From the point of view of numbers, the armies were evenly matched. Flamininus was also moving towards the city of Scotusa, and for 2 days the adversaries had been marching towards the city unaware of each other's presence, because between them was a range of high hills known as Cynoscephalae. On the morning of the third day, before the march resumed, both commanders ordered the complement of light infantry to move to the summit of the hills and explore the ground around them. The light troops followed their orders, and when they reached the summit, were greeted by the presence of their enemies, and they clashed. Thousands of projectiles were hurled, and in this opening move of their battle, the Roman light infantrymen were defeated and ran to their camp. Now, both sides were aware of each other's presence, and with this early victory, King Philip decided to risk a general engagement. Soon, his heavy infantrymen filed out of the camp and started to march up over the broken terrain. The Macedonian right soon reached the summit and deployed. The king took command of these troops and started to march downhill at a steady pace. But the Macedonian left had a longer and rougher trek, and when their king set off downhill, the left was still struggling to reach the summit and deploy. Consul Flamininus also decided to fight, and his army also moved out of the camp. His heavy infantrymen deployed on the center, while the cavalry deployed on the flanks with their 20 elephants placed on the right. And once the whole Roman army had been deployed, it began to move. As the legionnaires marched uphill, they easily brushed aside the Macedonian light infantry. But soon enough, Philip's dense phalanx of the Macedonian right flank arrived, and with their deadly pikes the Macedonians began hitting the legionnaires' dense formations, and slowly the maniples of the left of the Roman army started to give ground. And let me stop right here, because now we have to talk about how close order formations fought. In this case, we have the Macedonian phalanx against the Roman legion, and to understand the importance of how these organizations fought, we have to go back in time to analyze the earliest form of warfare, tribal warfare. In tribal warfare, when two tribes squared against each other on an open field, there will be two masses of warriors, loosely formed up in front of each other. And in due time, both masses of warriors will rush forward, yelling and screaming all the way in a headlong charge. With their loud screams and yells, each side hoped that the other will falter and retreat in panic before they crash. But if both sides continued with their mad dash, there were two options. In the first option, both sides would continue to rush forward until they crashed into each other. Then the action will degenerate into a chaotic brawl, in which every warrior fought as best as he could without proper support. In that way of fighting, with all of their concentration straight ahead, each warrior exposed himself to unseen strikes from the flanks or rear, and soon enough the casualties will escalate until one side finally broke and ran. That was one scenario. Then we have the second option. Both sides had started a mad dash, rushing forward and screaming as loud as they could. But seeing that their opponents did not break, both sides would stop their mad dash at the last possible moment. Now they would stand at a relatively short distance, close enough for warriors to exchange insults and launch projectiles against each other, but far away enough from hand-to-hand combat. It will be a standoff. But it would be a dynamic standoff, because from time to time, small groups of warriors will rush forward. When key individuals among them, natural fighters and leaders, will encourage their fellow warriors who were close by to surge forward. Those small attacks will have started, not forced by discipline, but by the bolder spirits among them. And out of those sporadic clashes, the accumulation of casualties and sheer physical and psychological exhaustion will cause one side to finally break and run. That was tribal warfare, and the loose deployment of the warriors of each tribe was an open deployment, where warriors stood at a distance from each other, and in their way of fighting, there was no cooperation between warriors. Millennia passed by, and with time, craftsmen developed for their warriors shields and helmets, and spears and swords. But beyond their equipment, warriors learned that in war, cooperation, order, and discipline are necessary to triumph over a well-organized foe. And those characteristics of cooperation, order, and discipline can be found in the close order formations, because in those formations, warriors worked as a team. In antiquity, the first close order formation created was the Phalanx, and the first phalanxes known to humanity were developed by the Sumerians. But eventually, the Sumerians disappeared, and for a long time the phalanxes disappeared with them, later to be reborn with the famous Greek phalanx. And in the Greek phalanx, the warriors known as hoplites learned to fight cooperating with each other, locking their big shields together and remaining shoulder to shoulder on their post during the whole battle. And in each phalanx, all warriors moved forward as one, so their locked shields created a solid defensive wall, while their spears created an offensive wall of spear points. That way, the close order formation known as the Phalanx was incredibly effective against any enemy who deployed in an open order formation, because in an open order formation, warriors acted independently from each other, with little or no cooperation among them. And when Greek phalanxes fought against each other, there were two options. In the first option, the men in the leading ranks will use their spears to hit their opponent numbers in a lengthy spear fight. And on the second option, for a while, it was used the otismos, which was a literal shoving match, trying to push the enemy phalanx out of the way using their shields and momentum. In this type of combat, of pushing shields against shields, pressure from the rear ranks gave one side an advantage, and in time, to have a greater advantage, it was sought to increase the phalanx's depth, so more ranks in the rear could add their weight to the pressure over the enemy line. For a while, otismos was used extensively, but eventually it was totally abandoned. We can easily assume that in the press of shields against shields, hundreds of men of both sides were crushed to death. Thus, in time, the only option for the phalanx was to use the spears of the men in the leading ranks. So the spears grew in length. Early Greek spears had a length of 7.9 feet, until in Hellenistic times, the spears reached the length of a massive pike of 24 feet. So, by the year 197 BC, the key to victory for the Macedonian phalanx was to outreach the enemy in a long-range fight with pikes, while also moving forward and pushing the adversary back until the enemy formation lost cohesion and ran. So, that was how the Phalanx fought against her enemies. Then we have the Romans. In their early history, the Romans also had the Phalanx. But after several crushing defeats, the Romans created the Manipular Legion. In each maniple of heavy infantry, the legionnaires also stood shoulder to shoulder with several ranks of troops behind the first rank to give depth to their unit. But the deployment of each maniple in a legion was different from that of the Phalanx. In a Phalanx, when it arrived to the battlefield, every single unit of hoplites were formed close to each other to create a single massive and continuous battle line. Instead, in the Roman legion, before the crash against a foe, the maniples of heavy infantrymen formed up at a distance from each other, thus creating an intermittent line. And behind the first line, there were two similar intermittent battle lines. This deployment, with small maniples moving in an intermittent line before the clash, gave the Roman Manipular Legion great flexibility and speed over any terrain, including broken terrain. So, that was the deployment in close order formations for either the heavy infantrymen in the Macedonian and in the Roman armies. But in any battle of that day, the first phase of any battle was the skirmish action between light infantry. And because the light infantrymen needed space to use their long-range weapons, they fought in open order formations, and they would open up the battle hurling projectiles against the enemy light infantry. And after a while, the light infantrymen who won that preliminary engagement will move forward and use the remaining projectiles against the enemy heavy infantry. They had to produce casualties and sap the morale of the opposing force. But usually, the effect of the light infantry was only marginal, and in the greatest majority of battles, the action was decided by the heavy infantrymen. In a typical battle, masses of heavy infantrymen of the opposing armies will close in, and as they did so, the Roman maniples will finally close up to form a continuous battle line. And in the few moments before the clash with their short-range weapons, the legionnaires will launch 2 volleys of javelins against their enemies. Then they drew their short swords for the close-range action. And let us always remember that even fighting with their short swords, the legionnaires were trained to always keep in their ranks. And that is how the Romans fought with their legionnaires, slashing and stabbing at their opponents with their swords. But after some minutes of action, the leading men in each maniple were ordered to fall back, while their comrades on the rear stepped forward to keep fighting. By periodically rotating the men in front, the Romans could keep the pressure over the enemy line for a long time. And not only that, but also the maniples that were behind the main line were a reserve that could be called upon to replace any unit that grew exhausted. That way, a Roman legion and a Roman army could fight longer engagements than any other army of their age. So that's it. Let us go back to the Battle of Cynoscephalae. The right flank of the Macedonian phalanx had enough time to deploy, and moving downhill, the Macedonians were using their weapons to good effect. Their pikes were being thrusted against Roman shields, heads, and limbs. From time to time, a legionnaire was hit and fell, while at the same time, the legionnaires tried to use their short swords against the pikes. In this rather long-range combat, casualties would have been rather light. But moving downhill, the Macedonians were gradually gaining ground. Yet, the Roman legionnaires were retreating in good order. Meanwhile, towards the Roman right, 10,000 legionnaires in their flexible maniples were marching uphill. They were led by 20 elephants, and were closing fast against the Macedonian left. And let us be clear, to fight, the Macedonian heavy infantry relied on a well-formed phalanx, and the Macedonian left flank had not yet deployed. And when those warriors saw the Roman mass advancing towards them in good order, their will to fight dissolved. The Macedonians broke ranks and ran, and that was a massive triumph for the Roman army. Half of the Macedonian army was retreating, and the Roman right went after that broken enemy. But at that moment, a Roman tribune took command of 20 maniples, close to 3,000 men. They turned about and marched against the exposed rear and flank of the Macedonian right. The Macedonian heavy infantrymen of that flank were unable to maneuver, and hit from that unexpected direction, they quickly broke, and the slaughter began. And always remember this: when there is a disproportionate amount of casualties in any battle, it is usually the product of a rout. Because when an army is routed, all cohesion is lost. Soldiers simply start running away, and when they do, they are slaughtered by the thousands. At Cynoscephalae, 8,000 Macedonians died, and 5,000 were taken prisoners. 50% of the Macedonian army was destroyed, while the Romans claimed only losing 700 dead plus a few thousand wounded. Philip V and some of his close supporters managed to escape, but his army had been destroyed, and unable to raise another, he sued for peace. Well, we have reached the end of another video, and in this one we have to recognize the enormous relevance of training warriors to fight in well-organized formations. In antiquity, warriors who fought at close quarters in open order formations were at a great disadvantage when fighting against an enemy who was deployed in a close order formation. The phalanxes were the first step in the evolution of close order formations. The front of a phalanx was really tough, but at the same time, the long and unwieldy continuous battle line of the phalanx had a serious drawback. It took time to deploy, and the phalanx could not maneuver with ease. And at the Battle of Cynoscephalae, the phalanx was further handicapped when it was ordered to move and deploy over broken terrain. On the other hand, the legion and her maniples were the next big step in the evolution of close order formations. The small maniples were flexible, were able to deploy and move with great speed, and only in the last moment the maniples will close in to form a continuous battle line to fight an enemy. Furthermore, behind the leading battle line of the legion there were always substantial reserves to be used at any time. And with those reserves and the switching back and forth of the men in the leading ranks of each maniple, the Roman legions could fight against their enemies for a long time, tipping the probabilities of success to their favor. And as a final note for this battle, the Romans had learned the advantage of local control. That meant freedom of action for junior officers to take decisions on the spot, to either exploit an advantage or face a threat. And in this battle, this local control is seen when a tribune took 20 maniples to attack the vulnerable rear of the Macedonian right phalanx. And that action, that was another factor that gave the Romans their great victory. Well, I hope that you liked this video, and in the next, I will explain the doctrine of defense in depth used by the Soviet army at the Battle of Kursk. Regards, Victor Aguilar-Chang.